Okay, good evening. Tonight we're going to speak more about the actual details of the Chanukah rebellion, and we'll start with the background of Alexander coming into Israel and annexing Israel into the Hellenistic Greek Empire. Alexander dies, and the empire is fragmented, and the two parts of Alexander's empire that concern us are that one was headquartered in Egypt, one part of the new Greek Empire of the Middle East, and that was the Ptolemaic Empire, and the other one was in Syria. Now, for the first 100 years after the break of the empire, we'll round it off to 300 BCE to 200 BCE. Israel is under the Ptolemaic Greeks, the Egyptian Greeks. At that time, the Jews were not persecuted. The only imposition that the Ptolemaic Greeks, the Egyptian Greeks, put upon the Jews was they sent a request that the Jews should send 72 great sages to Alexandria without telling them what they were sent there for. And once they were there, they were isolated and they were asked to translate the Torah into Greek, and that's where we get the Septuagint. That was the only imposition that we see that the Egyptian Greeks, the Ptolemaic, put on the Jewish people. But after the 100 years is over, around 200 BCE, the Syrian Greeks expand their empire south and east, and they now take up Israel into their empire. Initially, it wasn't too bad. 199, Antiochus III of Syria starts his rule of Israel, and there were really no problems. But 9 years later, he was expanding the empire. Rome was upset that the Greek Empire was becoming so strong there. So the Romans defeated him in battle, and he had to pay a big tribute. And for the tribute, he had to pay taxes. And the taxes, of course, he imposed on all of the people living in the empire, including the Jews. 3 years later, Seleucus IV takes over the throne, and he also needs new taxes. Now here is where the Chanukah story gets complicated, because the Hellenist Jews in Israel, who we mentioned last time, were part of the cause of the problem because they wanted to recast the Jewish people in a Hellenistic culture. So they were the ones that told the king that the Beis HaMikdash has a huge treasury. Like, you Greek king, Seleucus IV, come and take the money from the Beis HaMikdash. So you have the very bizarre idea of Jews themselves who are trying to curry favor with the Goyim, telling the Gentile Greek king that the Jews have a lot of money in the Beis HaMikdash, come go get it. And Seleucus attempts to loot the Beis HaMikdash. The traditional Jews donned sackcloth and prayed, and there was a miracle that he was prevented from looting that Beis HaMikdash. In 175, this Seleucus is murdered, and his younger brother Antiochus IV reigns. So just to look at a little chart, so Antiochus III is the first ruler over Israel, then Seleucus IV, and then when Seleucus IV dies, instead of his son becoming the king Demetrius was a hostage in Rome, Antiochus IV becomes the king, and he is the famous Antiochus that we're going to have our problems with. Okay, Antiochus ordered statues of himself placed in all the temples. The first problem, Jews don't put statues of anybody there. And he wanted to strengthen his reign by imposing Hellenism on all the people, which meant that the Jews no longer had the freedom to participate in their own religion. The Jewish Hellenists became very ambitious then, and they decided that they were going to bribe this Antiochus IV to depose the legitimate and from Kohen Gadol, Chonya, and replace him with his brother, who became a Hellenist and Hellenized his name to Jason. So it's under this Antiochus IV that the Kohen Gadol ceases to be a religious position. It's now in the hands of the Hellenists. And this Jason worked very hard to bring the Greek culture into Jewish people. He asked that the people of Jerusalem be considered honorary citizens of Antioch, which is the capital of the Syrian Greek Empire. He built a gymnasium next to the Beis HaMikdash. We read yesterday about the book of Maccabees, that when the sports started in the gymnasium, even the Kohanim would leave the Beis HaMikdash to go see. So this is a pretty sorry picture. Now, since Jason has nothing to do with religion, this is pure politics. So Jason sends his emissary Menelaus to pay his tribute to Antiochus IV, because after he's the Kohen Gadol by virtue of bribery. Now Menelaus figured if he has the bags of gold, why should he pay the king on behalf of the guy who sent him, on behalf of Jason? He offered the king even more gold if he, Menelaus, is made the Kohen Gadol. So now we have a lot of intrigue that you expect in a court, in a royal court, between different non-fit Kohanim Gedolim, each one wants his position. So Menelaus outbid Jason, and now the person who Jason had sent to pay off the king to keep his position Kohen Gadol outbid him, and now Menelaus is the Kohen Gadol. Okay. Chonya, unfortunately, the legitimate Kohen Gadol protested, was murdered by the Greeks. Okay, things get worse unto this Antiochus IV. Antiochus comes in, he violates the Beis Hamikdash, he removes the golden altar, the menorah, the shulchan, and all the golden kalim. So although we know that Titus later will remove these things, those were the things that were rebuilt by the Chashmonaim. The original golden kalim that the Jews built with the second temple are removed by Antiochus IV. And he was the one that made the laws that there should no longer be Shabbos, Yontav, Rosh Chodesh, Bris, Kashrus. Everything was ended. The Torah had to be burnt. And in 168 BCE, the 15th of Kislev, an idol was put up in the Beis HaMikdash. And that was basically the last straw. And at that point, Matisyahu leaves Yerushalayim and settles in Modi'in, which is about 10 miles away, to escape a tremendous anti-religious persecution in Jerusalem. Well, the king's forces are aware that Matisyahu is a prominent leader of the religious people, and they come with an offer. They tell him that if he will serve as an example of adopting Greek ways, and he would offer up a swine on an altar to Zeus, he would be considered a friend of the king, and there would be a tremendous reward. Of course, Matisyahu is a firm person, he refuses. But one of the other Jews says, the big reward for sacrificing a swine on the pagan altar, I'll do that. Matisyahu was enraged, and he killed this renegade, and then they killed the Syrian emissaries of the king. Now this incident is important as far as clarifying what Chanukah is about. Because when people talk about Chanukah as a celebration of religious pluralism, like the leader of Temple Emmanuel, the very beginning of Matisyahu's career gives light to that. This is not religious pluralism in any way. This is an attitude that Torah requires allegiance, and when Matisyahu sees a Jew breaking away, he took it on to himself to kill him. That's why I mentioned if Jews today would be well educated, most of our Jewish brothers and sisters would not be celebrating Chanukah. Because instead, what Chanukah must have looked like in terms of our modern perception is zealots from the temple are hiding and beginning guerrilla warfare, standing in the way of those people who like to espouse the modern Greek culture, and they actually murder an innocent Jew who just wanted to move ahead in a progressive manner. That's what Chanukah would have looked like. Rabbi Wein writes, and I quote, Chanukah is not that symbol of religious freedom that much of modern Jewry in its heartbreaking ignorance of its traditions believes it to be. It's rather a clear statement of an essential truth. The Torah demands of the Jewish people, individually and nationally, continuing sacrifice and unwavering commitment. Unfortunately, that's not very popular themes in America today, and that's why I mentioned that people really don't know what Chanukah is about, and maybe it's better that way. At least they have a mitzvah of lighting a menorah, but to understand the real message of Chanukah, it really would be a very strange, foreign, and maybe a negative idea in the minds of many Jewish people today. Okay, now the revolt begins. After all, Matisyahu killed not only the renegade Jew, but the Syrian emissary. So they can't live in Modi'in anymore where the Syrians will find them. They flee into the desert. They're joined by other loyal Jews. 6,000 Jews gather under Matisyahu's banner, and they begin guerrilla warfare. Now initially, the Syrian governor hears that there are a bunch of Frumis out in the desert somewhere. They're getting together a little army. He doesn't take them too seriously. You can imagine if we're Sameach, we have Eliezer here with a little marine experience, but most of us don't have that much experience. If you heard a few 6,000 alumni in War Sameach are gathered in the woods near the Canadian border to fight Gentile influence, I don't think too many people would be worried. But yet, and the Syrian governor, Philip, didn't take them seriously. So he just brought his local Syrian military to fight the guerrillas, but he lost. He says, hey, these guys know something about fighting. So battle won, the Jews are up. So then, Seran, who has an all-Syrian army, not only just the local militia, marches to Israel, and there at the pass of Beis Charon, Yehuda attacks him seriously, 2-up for the Jews. So the Jews have successfully had 2 battles with the Syrians, first with the local Syrian army defeated, then Seran brings in the official military all the way from Syria. They're defeated under Yehuda Maccabee's leadership also. Antiochus IV now knows that these yeshiva guys can fight, and he's got a problem on his hand. Now, armies take money. Today, we have a standing army, and we have huge government budgets, but apparently Antiochus IV didn't have enough money to maintain a large army. So he decides now he needs a large army to send against Yehuda Maccabee, and he needs money to support that army. There's no definite spending. He can't just sell bonds to China. So he's got to raise money. So Antiochus divides the Syrian army. He takes part of him with him to Persia to collect tribute from Iran, and part stays with Lysias, who heads a caretaker government in Syria, and Lysias, watching the home front, is in charge of crushing the Jewish rebellion, while Antiochus IV brings in fresh funds to pay for an army. So now we come to round 3, which will be the great challenge for the Maccabees. Lysias gathers together 3 of Syria's top generals, gives them 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Okay, so now they're facing this ragtag collection of Hashmonaim with 40,000 foot soldiers, 7,000 cavalry. Now they're so confident that they're going to win, they actually have slave dealers traveling in the back of the Syrian army, and they're already making deals to sell Jews as slaves. Yehuda's troops gather at Mitzpah. They're praying, and he divides them into 4 battalions of 1,000 each. He only has 4,000 people at this time to face 47,000 battle-tested Syrians, 7,000 on cavalry. L'maisa, he wins. The 4,000 Jews defeat 47,000 battle-tested soldiers. So that's battle number 3, and Yehuda Maccabee is still on top. 1 year later, Lysias decides, I need a bigger army. Now, there's 60,000 infantry. Yehuda's number is up to 10,000, so now it's 10,000 against 60,000, and Yehuda wins again. So Lysias despairs of victory, returns to the capital in Syria. So the Maccabees are now 4-0 against the Greeks. It's at this point, after the 4th campaign, when Yehuda has led the small Jewish troops against the Greeks 4 times, and they've defeated an army of 60,000 people, Yehuda now goes to Yerushalayim, and they rededicate the Beis HaMikdash 3 years after its desecration. It was desecrated in 168 with the idols. Now 165 BCE, 3 years later. You realize that as the years go later, the numbers get shrink as you get closer to 0. So it's now 165 BCE, 3 years after 168 BCE. At that point, they come to Yerushalayim, they rededicate the Beis HaMikdash. Now, one shouldn't think at this point that the war is over. Yehuda not only doesn't control the entire land of Israel, but Yehuda's troops only control part of Yerushalayim. Much of the countryside is still controlled by the Syrian Greek Gentiles and the Misyavnim, the Hellenist Jews. So this is certainly not a celebration of political or military victory, because they ain't really achieved either of the two yet. Politically, most of the land is in the hands of the enemy. And militarily, they're going to face a lot more battles. So the idea of lighting the menorah to celebrate victory is really premature. We're not celebrating victory. What we're celebrating is that when people make an effort to do mitzvos, Hashem enables them to do mitzvos. It's purely a religious celebration, because politically and militarily we're still not done. But the idea that when the Jews are able to control a strip of Jerusalem and they want to rededicate the Beis HaMikdash and there's no oil or not enough oil for the 8 days, and God makes it possible for them to do it, that is the celebration of Chanukah. That when you try to do mitzvos, Hashem will say, you're trying to do the right thing, I'm going to empower you. So the empowerment of mitzvah doers, that would be, in one sense, the proper theme of Chanukah. Okay, now at this time, the Gentiles are still upset that the traditional Jews are doing so well, so they start persecuting the Jews in their own areas of Israel outside the area of Jerusalem that Yehuda controls. And Yehuda now makes a strategic decision. He sent troops to the Galil and to Gilead to defend them, but he saw it was too difficult. So he said, you know what, we're just going to have to bring the Jews into Jerusalem, where it will be easier to defend them. So now we have an interesting example of pulling out and condensing the population you have to protect. That was something that now at times Israel did when they figured the settlers around Gaza, it was too difficult for the IDF to defend them. So I'm not knowledgeable enough in the modern situation to say right or wrong, but I would say that you have a precedent in history, although you don't know if it's exactly comparable, but basically Yehuda made the call that if you have to defend Jews, instead of trying to defend them stretched out and scattered, you might be better off to concentrate them where it's easier to defend them. That was Yehuda's call. So the Jews from the Galil and the Gilead were brought to Yerushalayim, and there it would be easier to protect them. Okay, Antiochus IV, who all this time was in Persia trying to collect money to support these vast numbers of soldiers he had to send against the Jews, was not successful, and he died a horrible death on the road, some disease that rendered his body so offensive that nobody would come near him. So it's a pretty sad end to this king, Antiochus, who started all the problems with the Jewish people. And in his place, his son, Antiochus V, is going to reign. Okay. Now, again, the Hellenists see that the traditional Jews have some degree of control in Yerushalayim. They couldn't make peace with that idea, so they send a message to Lysias, who was the caretaker government in Antioch, come back, don't give up. And this, again, is the second recorded event of how the Jews brought the tragedy on themselves. The Hellenistic Jews, who can't abide the idea that the traditional people are making progress against Hellenism, they're begging the Greeks to come back. So it's not the Greeks that are the ones who are defeating us. It's the Jews who want the Greeks to come in. They're begging Lysias. So Lysias now sends the largest army ever to Yehuda to give it the fifth try to defeat the Maccabees. This time 100,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, and the first time battle elephants. So this will be the biggest struggle that the Maccabees have. And Yehuda's brother Elazar killed the lead elephant, thinking that the commander was atop it. And that's an interesting question. Although we know suicide is not allowed in halacha, apparently in battle there is something to be said for committing suicide, because if you go in the underside of an elephant and you kill it, hoping to topple the commander, you know you're going to die. But he did that on the battlefield, but it didn't help. The huge Syrian army won victory after victory against the Hashmonaim, until the Hashmonaim have to hole up in a fortress in Har Zion, and they seem to be on the path to defeat in this fifth battle. At this critical moment, it's not the military strength of Yehuda that's going to save the day, but Hashem intervening. Because as Lysias' huge army that we mentioned, 100,000 infantrymen, 20,000 cavalry, and the elephants, is poised to tighten the noose around Yehuda Maccabee and his brothers, there is a rebellion going on back in Syria in Antioch. And Lysias has to hurry back to put down the local rebellion in Syria. So you have a case where the civil war in Syria is saving the Jews. It's interesting to think about today with all the unrest that's going on in Syria, whether that's taking some pressure off of Israel, I don't know. But in that time, that's exactly what God did. He stirred up a civil war in Syria so that now Lysias and his huge army can't finish tightening the noose around Yehuda Maccabee. Instead, they have to go back to Syria. So here we see that Chanukah was not a pure military victory won on the battlefield with the might of the Hashmonaim. When the Hashmonaim were defeated militarily or on the way to defeat, Hashem had to intervene politically. We have recorded the speech that Lysias gave his troops, is recorded in the book of Maccabees. And Lysias said that we're getting weaker with every day, food is scarce, and the place against which we're encamped is strongly fortified, because the Maccabees are in Har Zion in a fortified area. And now we are concerned with royal matters. Let us therefore extend our right hand to these men and make peace with them and their people. So Lysias is telling the soldiers, time for a peace treaty. Now listen to these words. Let us allow them to observe their religion as they always have done, because it is only in defense of their religion, which we have suppressed, that they arose and acted as they did. This was not a political event. The Jews were not looking to fight Greece because they wanted political independence. As long as the Greeks let them practice Torah and mitzvos, they were not going to protest the fact that the Greeks were the superpower. Lysias is telling us in his own words, the Jews only rose up when they had to defend their ability to practice their religion. So Chanukah has nothing to do with political freedom. They didn't fight for it. They fought because they wanted to be able to be Yidden. So, yes?
At what point did they come in? At what point did the Greeks turn to them and say that the Gezerah of not allowed to study Yiddishkeit itself, to practice? At what point did they come in? I mean, the battle was for years. At what point did they actually...
Well, from the very beginning, Antiochus IV forbade them to keep Shabbos and Yontiv and Bris. Right. So it's obvious from there, but I wanted to quote from the mouth of the Greeks themselves. Here you have the Greek generals saying they were not fighting to Greek domination politically. All they wanted was the ability to do Torah mitzvos. So to us, it's obvious from the very beginning, but I wanted a quotation from the mouth of the Greek general himself.
Was there a turning point where it actually became that much harder, when not even study could...
Of course, when Matisyahu had to run away from Yerushalayim because of the anti-religious pressure there. So from the very beginning, once Antiochus IV started his anti-Jewish legislation, it became very difficult to be a Jew. So now, after 5 campaigns, and the divine intervention at the end, when it looked like they were going to be defeated, God stirred up the civil war back in Syria. Lysias and Yehuda now have a peace treaty, officially abolishing all anti-Jewish legislation of Antiochus. The 28th day of Shvat was designated a festival in Megillas Tanis. There was a Megillas Tanis which recorded all the happy days of Jewish history, and it records events that we don't celebrate today because we say today that the Megillas Tanis is bottled since there have been so many events. But the 28th of Shvat was set aside as a holiday to celebrate the treaty between the Greeks and the Jews. Unfortunately, we'll say that not every treaty is listened to, because when you get a new administration, the treaty goes into the garbage. And this will be a very good warning for Israel today. Anyway, we're anticipating events. After they have this official treaty, the problem is the Antiochus is thrown out of power. We mentioned that Antiochus III had a son. Antiochus III had Seleucus was the king. When he died, Antiochus IV, who was that troublemaker, took over. And now Demetrius escapes from Rome, and he assumes the power, and he's going to repudiate any treaties made by the previous administration. So Demetrius, who is the son of we have Antiochus III, Seleucus, then Antiochus, but now Demetrius says, wait a minute, I'm the son of the previous king. I wasn't crowned, so I was a hostage in Rome, but now that I'm free, the kingdom went from my side of the family. He kills Antiochus V, the son of Antiochus IV, and now he declares the peace treaty with the Jews void. Just like today, we're afraid that we don't know if the new Egyptian government will honor the treaty that the Egyptians made with the state of Israel. This is the problem throughout history. You get a new administration, the same country, they say, we're not responsible for those treaties. So now, under Demetrius, we're going to have war again. And Alchemist, who was a Kohen and a leader in the Hellenist Jewish circle, convinced the new king to renew the battle against Yehuda. So this is at least the 3rd time that we have evidence that the Hellenist Jews themselves were motivating the Greek king not to give up and to try to take back the land of Israel. And unfortunately, this new battle the Greeks exert a lot of pressure, and traditional Jews are repressed. And Yehuda has to regroup his army. They thought that they could disband because they have a treaty. Now Yehuda has to regroup his army. And they face the 6th battle, in which Yehuda's forces destroy a Syrian army of 35,000. So apparently the Syrians at this point think they don't even need such a big army, because the only time they were successful was when they had 120,000 soldiers and elephants. At this time, the new king, Demetrius, thinks he could do it with 35,000, so he's defeated in battle, the 6th battle. Then Demetrius sends another army under Bachides, and at this point, many of Yehuda's troops desert. Now, I don't know if we're told why they desert, but I would imagine that they're losing heart because it's difficult to keep on fighting when you win and you win and you win, and there's no end to the fighting. At this point, Yehuda has 800 men left, no longer thousands. And the Jewish force was defeated, and Yehuda is killed in the year 160, which means 5 years after the Ness of Chanukah, the Jewish army is in disarray, and Yehuda, their great general that led them in 5 successful campaigns, is dead. So the remaining troops regroup under Yonasan, and they begin guerrilla warfare again. And under Yonasan, they're able to get another peace treaty with the Syrians. Apparently, the Syrians were unable to demolish Yonasan's new army. So in 157, it's a second peace treaty. Okay. In Syria, the civil wars are continuing, and between the two houses, the families of Seleucus and Antiochus IV and their descendants, there's constantly executions going on, rebellions going on. So this lack of a unified government in Syria is playing into the hands of the Jews. And at the end, Tryphon, who has another Greek army, was able to lure Yonasan into negotiations, and there at the peace group, when they got together for the peace treaty, the Syrians killed the Jewish general. They killed Yonasan. They betray him, and then they march on Yerushalayim, now that the Jewish general has been killed. And in this case, what saves the Jews at the last moment is a heavy snowstorm. And Tryphon can't take over Jerusalem because of this heavy snowstorm. So we've seen that when the Jewish army faltered, we had a civil war back in Antioch, Syria, that diverts the troops back to Syria. And in this case, Tryphon's near victory was snatched from him because of a snowstorm. Now, it would be interesting to check the records of how many big snowstorms there were in Israel, but I don't think it's a daily event. So this probably was viewed by the frum people as the Yad Hashem at that time. So Shimon, by this time, is the last remaining of the 5 Chashmonaim, and he retaliates for Tryphon's treachery by throwing his support to the other side, which is Demetrius II. Tryphon was on the side of Antiochus IV from that family. So in the time of the Syrian civil war, Shimon, with whatever political prestige he has, supports Demetrius II, and Demetrius II prevails, and he recognizes Shimon as the ruler over Eretz Yisrael. And Shimon, out of the last 5 brothers, is the one that's able to savor victory. So finally, at this point, the Jews have a little bit of rest. And Shimon was declared the Nasi. There were coins that were minted declaring Judea's independence. And this was the first time since we went back to build the second temple under the Persians, then were taken over by Alexander, then the Talmud Greeks, and then the Syrian Greeks. Finally, at this point, the Jews are actually independent. And this will be the only period during the Second Temple that we have our independence. From the time that Shimon, the last brother of the Maccabees, is the Nasi, and for a while, things were peaceful. In the second book of Chashmonaim, he describes the blessings of this period. The Jews could till their soil in peace, the land yielded its crops, the trees gave the produce, old people could sit in the courtyard, young people were dressed richly, Shimon laid up food in cities and weapons in case of war. In other words, they were making an economy that was geared to withstand enemies. His fame spread far and wide. He brought common confidence, and Israel was glad and rejoiced, and they dwelt everyone under his vine and fig tree with no one to make them afraid. The voice of war was no longer heard throughout the land, and the arrogance of the despots was subdued. He raised the honor of the Beis HaMikdash and increased the number of vessels in the temple. This is the high point of Chanukah. But 4 out of the 5 brothers have been killed on the battlefield, and unfortunately, Shimon himself was murdered by his own son-in-law, who was from the Tzdukim, from the Misyavnim, and the house of the Chashmonaim eventually left its connection to tradition, and it faded into oblivion. So that poses the question, so what exactly are we celebrating? It's certainly not religious pluralism, as we pointed out that Matisyahu started the rebellion by killing a renegade Jew. It wasn't fought for political independence. This is not Paul Revere, because the people are willing to be politically dependent on Greece as long as they don't bother us with our religion. It wasn't a celebration of military might, in that at least twice they were on the verge of defeat, but God had to intervene with either politics or with snow. So what we're celebrating is the fact that Kodesh Baruch Hu showed the Jews that if you want to come back to me, I'll help you keep the Torah. If there's no oil around, I'll make the oil work in a miraculous manner. And Hashem blessed the military ishtadlus of the Chashmonaim. And we daven, we say in that tefillah, Masarti giborim biyad chaloshim. You have given over the mighty in the hands of the weak. That tefillah itself diffuses a lot of the American propaganda in the modern Jewish world about Chanukah, that we did it with our muscles. In davening we say, you Hashem, Masarti giborim. You were the one that gave over mighty Greek armies into the hands of those who really were weak, because the Chashmonaim were not militarily strong. It was only HaKadosh Baruch Hu that did it. And that's the Chanukah that we celebrate. One could ask, though, if the Second Temple period was a time that we started by being under the superpowers, and that period of independence did not last so long, is there any way to be happy with that? Is there any way to celebrate? So I'd like to close with the Rashi in the Gemara in Sukkah. I believe it's Nun Hey. There we talk about Simchas Beis HaShoeva, the rejoicing by the drawing of the water on Sukkot. And the Mishnayos tells us, the Brisa, Mishal Lara Simchas Beis HaShoeva, Lara Simcha Miyamav. Person didn't see the rejoicing at that time, never saw rejoicing in his life. And Rashi there has a little note. Even though in the Second Temple period, most of the time we were under the thumb of different superpowers, the Jews still rejoiced in the fact that they could worship HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Beis HaMikdash was in our hands. That was enough reason to rejoice, even if politically we're not completely independent. The message that I take from that Rashi that's practical in our lives is that many people are unhappy and they say, if only this would happen, if only that would happen, when the perfect situation comes, then I'll be happy. But you know what? Our life is never going to be perfect. Just like the Jewish people in the Second Temple period, most of the time it wasn't perfection. We were under the influence of superpowers, just like today in Eretz Yisrael, they're concerned with what Washington has to say. But that doesn't stop us from having a simcha in the Beis HaMikdash. The situation is not perfect, but you don't need perfection to have simcha. And I think that's a very practical message for Chanukah, for all of us, that we can celebrate the fact that we have an opportunity to do Torah and mitzvahs even in situations less than perfection. I think that understanding what Chanukah is all about and understanding that we can celebrate even less than perfect situations can give us a meaningful Chanukah. But since there are a few minutes remaining, I'd like to talk about some very practical do's and don'ts when it comes to Chanukah, and a lot of times people get together at parties. Now this year, Thanksgiving is coming at the same time of Chanukah, and you hear a lot in the secular media advice for how to have a Thanksgiving dinner in peace. Because families get together who haven't seen each other for a while, and sometimes old arguments are revisited, people don't treat each other nicely. And in the secular world, the holiday season becomes a time of tremendous disappointment. You know, there's this aura around the holiday season, just to paraphrase a little bit, as some singer had this tremendously popular song, I'm dreaming of a perfect holiday. Perfect holiday is my own words. But anyway, you probably, you recognize the tune. I'm dreaming of that perfect thing. And because it's not perfect, people get very depressed. Therapists write that after the holiday season, they have more customers. It's good, just like there's a lot of buying and going on for department stores. So for department stores, it's Black Friday. For therapists, it's after the holiday season with all the people who are disappointed that the whole year they're looking forward to, life is tough, but when the holiday season comes, everything's going to be great. And it's not so great. And because of that, they're disappointed for the rest of the year. I'd like to share with you a few ideas from the Parsha, from the parshas that we've had about how to make family gatherings work. Okay, by Yosef, we know that the problem of Yosef was that Yaakov showed favoritism to one son. Chazal say that a parent should never show favoritism to anybody. Very practical advice. You're together with other people, the family gets together. Nobody should be thinking about who the favorite person of the family is, because everybody has to feel important. And there's a beautiful piece from Reb David Feinstein that I think is well illustrated with the story from Hawaii. Did I speak about the 7-cow wife in Hawaii? Did I do that story here? Oh, so there's a great story that in Hawaii on the islands, the custom was that if a man became engaged, he would give the father of the kala, the father of the bride, a dowry. He would give that side money. Just like Yaakov had to give Lavan. Today it's very common that the woman's side helps support the boy, but different periods of time we see, it depends. I think the Rachaim says it depends on supply and demand. How many girls are there in the marketplace and how many boys? So in Yaakov and Lavan's time, the boys had to pay the father-in-law, and that's why Yaakov worked for those 14 years for his wives. So in Hawaii, apparently it was the same thing. There was a fellow in Hawaii that was known to be a really good businessman, the bargainer. And everybody was wondering what kind of wife he was going to get at what price. And lo and behold, they heard that he had paid 7 cows, which was a huge sum for a wife, and you'd expect to get Miss Hawaii for that. And instead, the woman that he got as a bride was not known to be of exceptional beauty. And everybody was amazed. This guy who was so smart paid 7 wives for Stam Akala. So he gathered together all his friends for a tea. And then at the tea, his Kala came in. And she was just radiantly beautiful. And everybody saw that sometimes a really smart person knows the biggest bargain is not to give somebody the idea, I got you so cheap. The way you make people beautiful is make them feel important. The fact he was willing to pay so much for a person who didn't think they themselves were worth it, that's how she became so beautiful in the story. So it sounds like a Goyish story. Listen to what Reb David says about Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov worked 7 years because he's in love with Rachel. Rachel is a 7-year wife. So Lavan tricks him and says, well, I understand, but you have to take Leah. Logically, what Yaakov should have said is, listen, the one I wanted was a 7-year wife. Now I've got to take Leah. Okay, so for Leah I'll work 3 extra years. You know what I mean? But 7 years was the price for the desired wife. Reb David Feinstein said that Yaakov Avinu, even if he was tricked, did not want to make Leah feel bad. And if he wouldn't have worked 7 years for Leah, she would have never felt valued. And that's a tremendous lesson. What people need in this world is to feel chashuv. And that's the biggest gift you can give people when you get together at Chanukah or any other time. It's a gift that goes beyond giving material objects. Because Baruch Hashem, in America, we don't need material objects. Most people have what they need to survive. The biggest thing that people need to know is that they are chashuv. When Shammai said, Have mekabelos kol adam b'sever panim yafos, to receive people with a smile, the Meiri says you should try to give off a vibe to these people to make them feel that you are the source of my happiness and it's so wonderful to see you've made my day. It's a tall order. They say that there were tzaddikim that were able to do that. That when the person felt this tzaddik's warmth, like they say about the Manchester Rav, when you spoke to him on the phone, you could feel him hugging you through the wires. That's the kind of feeling that even if we're not such big tzaddikim, but at least we see people, try to make them feel important. I'm glad to see you. What are you doing with your life? I'm really interested in you. That's l'maisa, a wonderful thing that Yaakov and his working 7 years for Leah can teach us. So the idea of not showing favoritism, instead to give everybody the feeling that they are valuable, these are among tremendous messages that we can give to other people. Now, a person honestly might ask, he says, why should I show that this person is so chashuv? I mean, he's, pretty much of a lowlife. He's not, I know much more important people than this guy. And the answer to that, I think, is there's a halacha. If, God forbid, a Jew was told, kill somebody else to save your own life, we know he's not allowed to do it. Because the Gemara says, why do you think your blood is redder than the other person? The Ger Rebbe asked, he says, what happens if the person that's in danger of being killed is a big tzaddik, and he only has to kill a guy who's a drunkard? So what do you mean I don't know who's more valuable? I don't know that tzaddik is more valuable than the drunkard? The Ger Rebbe answered, we have no idea the value of people. Because people should not be rated by what they accomplished, but what effort they went in to making the choice that they've done. You might have a tzaddik who had a very pure nature, who was born as a child, he loved to learn, he loved to do mitzvahs, and he accomplished a huge amount. But it wasn't hard for him. There was no sweat. That drunkard on the street that looks like he accomplished very little, maybe one day he had an urge to kill somebody to get $5 for a bottle of beer. And he struggled inside. I want that beer. So I just put a knife in his belly and I get $5 for a bottle of beer. And he resisted. He said, it's not right to kill. And it was hard for him. That person might be more than the Rebbe. And that thought, if we internalize, is how you give chashivas to everybody. Because we have no idea who the real stars of the world are. You know, we're in the yeshiva, we give covet to the Rosh Yeshivas for what they have accomplished. But in heaven, it's not what you accomplished, it's the effort. And we might find out that in Olam Haba, a lot of Bachrim and Sameach are more than any of the Rosh Yeshivas. And with that feeling, we can give chashivas to every single person. And that's the kind of feeling we bring into Chanukah. We get together with people we might not be familiar with, or we might not have socialized for a while, and you can have awkward moments. Our approach has to be that every Jew, we have no idea how to value them. You never know how precious a Jew is. And if we have that approach, and we give people the idea that I value you, should realize how important you are, that could be the biggest present you can give to somebody in Chanukah when you interact with family and friends. So we should have a Chag Sameach, we should all celebrate Chanukah, that Adlakas Neiros should be uplifting, and as we uplift ourselves, we should think about uplifting every human being together with us. Thank you very much for listening.